Hello everyone, I'm Matt, and my pledge to you today is that there will be no Shrek jokes in the course of this video. Today's build is another high grade from the non-Gundam side of the coin, the Daisy Ogre, as seen in Bandai Namco's 2023 anime Synduality Noir. Part of a multimedia project involving television, manga, novels, and an upcoming video game, the franchise takes place in a post-apocalyptic future, where folks known as drifters gather valuable resources in the rather weirdly named cradle coffins, heavily armed mechs that don't look a million miles away from the Kobu of Sakura Wars fame. The drifters are aided in their job by a bejesus, a humanoid artificial intelligence that provides support to the pilot in combat and scavenging. This particular unit, the Daisy Ogre, is piloted by the drifter Kanata, alongside the mysterious bejesus Noir, who has no memories but game-changing combat abilities. The mecha itself is also designed by the one and only Ege Gilbow, a mainstay of modern Gundam responsible for iconic suits like the Vidar and the Schwarzette. Whilst I haven't watched the series, I've been keeping an eye out for the video game, Echo of Ada, and I was interested in checking out the kits, as the heavy-duty design and graffiti-like decor really appealed to me. Unfortunately, Synduality's model kit range seems to have gone the way of Kaiyukai Senki, in that no one bought the things or watched the telly show. This ended up working in my favour. In the UK, this kit retails around £35, but I imported it from Japan for just 18 quid. This isn't the first Synduality kit I've built. Whilst guest starring on a stream by fellow Gunpla builder MJ2005 Gundam, I put the high-grade Gilbow together, and it was an enjoyable build with lots of detail. And stickers, but more on those later. Between them, the two kits only share some internal frame pieces and the hands, so this still feels like a pretty fresh build. Inside the box, you get 10 runners, which range from large to rather tiny, and on first inspection, the colour separation looks fantastic. There is still 2 sheets of stickers to contend with though. One is the usual foil sheet, and contains a mix of smaller details like geometric patterns, batteries, and some of those graffiti markings. However, you also get a sheet of real grade style decals with transparent backing. As well as some more geometric patterns and graffiti designs, there's a variety of warning markings and unintelligible writing to decorate the set with. I'll discuss these more as I go through the build, but I will say that I wasn't surprised to see this amount of stickers. Particularly, those dazzle ship-like patterns would have been rather tough to do in plastic at this scale and grade. Starting off, I took a rather different approach to usual, and panel-lined most of the kit before assembly. My reasons for doing this were twofold. I knew I'd need to do it before applying all of those stickers, or I'd potentially be covering up panel lines and leaving them half-filled. The other reason was that I had 24 hours to kill waiting for the primer on the pilot figures to cure. More on them shortly. There's plenty of panel lining to do on the kit, and I mostly used my fine liner Gundam marker and black 0.03 nib size Unipin pen to do the work. The former wasn't quite thin enough to fit the rather thin panel lines, but it filled them with no trouble, and a once over with my plastic eraser produced really clean and consistent results, as well as being absurdly satisfying to use. I ended up using the Unipin pen for most of the set, as I filled in the circular details around the unit to imply further depth, and panel lined the grey and dark blue armour with it as well. It is a little messier than the Gundam marker if you're impatient, but giving it time to dry before erasing any stray ink did the trick for me. At this point in the video, I'd like to demand Uni release their grey and brown fine liners in 0.03 size as well, because I'd never have to buy panel lining pens ever again. I panel lined the fluorescent green pieces of the kit with my brown Gundam marker for a slightly more neutral tone, but besides the gun and feet, I ended up erasing much of what I did. Whilst the instructions seemed to recommend a high contrast approach, I wasn't keen on the results in person. This wasn't the only Gundam markering I did on the kit, but the other work is more specific to each section, so I'll discuss that during the actual building. Spoiler warning, it involves chrome. Supplied with the kit are two static figurines of series protagonists Kanata and Noir, the former seen here doing his best Crazy Frog tribute. They're both moulded in pure white and built from two pieces, which does create a rather glaring but easily removed seam line in Noir's case. I have painted pilot figures in the past, specifically those included in the high-grade YF-19 and Aoshima Ingram Unit 2 from Patlabor, and besides making the final kit look more interesting, I figured I could really do with the painting practice after the lovely experience I had painting the Zaku's backpack. I learned my lesson from last time, and I primed using Colourforge's White Bone Primer. It's a spray can that's colour matched to the Citadel Wraithbone base paint. This made painting the brighter colours much easier, particularly with Kanata's clothing and Noir's hair. I even did a rare spot of paint mixing in order to create the two-tone black and grey on Noir's pants and jacket. Whilst I tried to follow the colour guide as close as possible, I did take a few liberties, some of which came down to personal preference and some of which was down to paint availability. For example, Kanata's jacket probably should have been a darker yellow, versus the orange I went with, but my pot of Avalanche Sunset has taken on the appearance of sick, so that was a non-starter. Likewise, the turquoise I used for Noir's hair was perhaps slightly stronger than it should have been, but I did reduce the saturation with a bit of thinned white paint brushed over the top. As mentioned last time, I'm not particularly great at filming my painting sessions, mainly because the footage is either obscured by my hands, or it's several minutes of me gurning at a small stick of plastic. I did at least get some footage of the slightly less precise process of shading this figure, which I did with my trusty set of Citadel shade paints, particularly Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. Usually, I prefer to apply these paints as I would a panel liner, tracing along the raised edges with a small brush, but in the interests of time and contrast, I used the
"does the figure in shade paint and pray for decent results"
method instead. This was followed by some light dry brushing to re-establish the brighter colours slightly. The finishing touches were adding some slightly funky eyes with my Unipin pen, something that took several goes on each figure until I got the least worst results, as well as a dab of chrome on the dog tag around Kanata's neck. One blast of matte varnish later, and the dynamic duo were good to go. It was a really fun afternoon painting these things up, and it served as a useful refresher on how I used to paint my minis and all. One day, Tyranids, your day will come. But mech pilots aren't much without a mecha, so it's finally time to actually build the Daisy Ogre, starting with the body, which makes up a fair chunk of the build due to the mech's design. It's arguably got enough going on to rival a real grade for complexity and all. Much of this stems from the parts layering involved, with some areas made out of quite a few pieces. For instance, the lid of the cockpit consists of the white outer armour, an inner grey section for connecting to the unit, and a slightly translucent black piece for the windscreen. There's also a lot of interaction between parts, such as the functioning pistons in the cockpit, and the way the torso batteries and coffin ceiling are kept in place by the outer armour. Besides the ab crunch, other joints include 2 points of articulation for the pistons, ball-jointed armour at each side, and the doors and ceiling of the coffin round the back. The ceiling keeps the doors locked into place, which is rather handy. In general, a lot of the pieces are quite large and detailed, implying armour separation through moulded detail rather than plastic separation, and there's some sandwiching of parts going on, although the seam lines that are there have mostly been integrated as panel lines or armour edges. One seam line is even covered up by a sticker, the battery on the back of the unit. Unfortunately, the horns are made of 2 pieces for some reason, so there's a rather rubbish vertical seam line to clean up on them. As you can probably see here, one cleaned up much nicer than the other. When it came to detailing up the body, the stickers did remind me of my high-grade Durandal Valkyrie slightly, particularly when it came to placement and quantity. Compared to that kit, I did find fewer fitting issues or awkward placements to deal with though. Once in situ, the stickers mostly look great, with the stripes on the front and the green on the horns standing out really nicely. There's some more familiar applications for the foil stickers and all, with some teal lights to apply to the front of the unit. You get 6 different options for the area below the cockpit, with each giving the Daisy Ogre an almost emoticon-like face. At this scale, it's a little easy to miss, but it's a nice touch that supplies even more personality to the kit. As for painting, I went to town on the smaller details, with my chrome Gundam marker being applied to pretty much all the pistons on show. It's the sort of small job that marker was made for, and it does an excellent job at making recessed details like the inner shoulders stand out. Of course, it did also create some tolerance issues with the cockpit pistons, making them far tougher to get into position. Repeated use did sort this out, at the cost of tarnishing the chrome finish, but the final look is probably more realistic looking, so I can't complain. I also decided to paint a few details inside the cockpit, such as the control console and the rim towards the front. The latter was based on a screen cap of the anime, but on further inspection it probably should have been the actual controls I painted, rather than the rim. This paint job was done with the Gundam marker EX Shine Silver, as I didn't want the mirror-like chrome finish in this case. With the rather involved torso out of the way, the arms feel like a much more compact build experience. That doesn't mean they're simplistic though. For the most part, they're visually symmetrical, with the shoulder armour on either side being the most obvious divide. And speaking of divides, there's a lovely seam line running right down the right hand shoulder armour, which is not only rather awkward to remove, but also feels pretty unnecessary in an age where seamless Zaku shoulder pauldrons exist. Combining it with cement was no problem, but getting in between the spikes with a sanding stick is a bit of a tough ask. For this, I recommend acquiring some smaller sanding sticks, like the Bandai ones seen here, and cutting them to size, which in this case did a pretty cracking job. To finish things off, I whacked a bit of matte varnish on the piece to remove any scratches. I usually do all my top coating at the end of a build, but it was bugging me way too much to wait. Otherwise, the build feels familiar compared to other high grades, mainly in how the arms plug into the torso and the armour is constructed. In the case of the former, the usual ball joints are replaced by heavier duty pegs. This does come at the cost of back and forth motion when the arms are relaxed, but the arms are proportioned in such a way that a cross-body angle is possible for firing poses and the like. Far more unusual is the elbow bend. It's the 2-point bend you'd expect from a modern kit, but it's built around a sliding mechanism that provides the full range of motion. Said range is nothing mind-blowing due to the lower arm armour clashing with the upper arm's batteries, but it's definitely an improvement on the unextended arm, which doesn't even make it past 90 degrees. It's a clever way of giving the kit more posability without affecting the proportions in more neutral poses. Further posability is implemented in the hands and wrists, which are ball jointed as always, but also benefit from a rock solid up and down pivot, alongside a ball jointed thumb. The fingers for the open hand are all one piece, whilst the hand for holding the rifle is constructed from a trigger finger, followed by 3 closed fingers that wrap around the rifle handle. To assist with the rather chunky rifle, the trigger finger has a peg to keep the handle in situ too. Finally, the left arm has an additional grey section for the large chain weapon to store. The top opens, making the chain much easier to plug in. In terms of detailing the arms, it was a similar affair to the torso, just on a smaller scale. There's plenty of stickers to use, including those shiny pink batteries, although it's mainly the real grade-esque warning decals you'll be using here. They look alright on the lighter plastic, but the borders do show up a bit more on the darker plastic. For best results, I recommend approaching them as you would a screen protector, by giving it a once-over with a soft cloth and some pressure. As with the body, the flashy decorations and those fluorescent green accents on the shoulders imbue a lot of flair into the mecha, making it feel less like a war machine and more like a character in its own right. To wrap up the arms, I applied some Gundam marker inside the joints, to break up the grey plastic a little and of course, provide visual interest. Rather than sending it into Gundam Valhalla, shiny and chrome again, I decided to use my gold marker instead, for an effect that stands out without being quite as strong. The waist is constructed as part of the main body, but I figured I'd give it a minute of its own, given how much time I'd already spent on the body. It's pretty bog standard, with a peg connection to the upper body giving you rotation and rotation alone. and there's some pretty big ball joints for the legs. I'll discuss them more when everything's assembled, but even as a serious apologist for ball-jointed Gunpla hips, they're a bit rough. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll probably know I like saying the legs were the most involved part of the build at some point. Well, in a shocking twist, the legs are probably the simplest part of this build. Cats and dogs, pigs flying, etc. Of course, this is a fairly complex high grade, so even though it's simpler than usual, the leg build still has a good amount of joints and features to enjoy. In keeping with the rather compact design of the entire mecha, the legs take on a compressed appearance, compacting to support the weight of the body and arms. As with the upper arms, the feet and wheels are symmetrical, and visually the rest of the legs are too. It's just a few pieces, such as the upper leg assembly being mirrored, and the mismatched knees, that differ. The bulk of construction is spent snapping the leg frame together, then affixing the outer armour to it. In the case of the upper leg, I did muck this up at first, for which I blame the song Soup by Can. I can't introduce you all to it due to copyright restrictions, but let me assure you, that record goes places. Something else to note is that on the surface, the Daisy Ogre appears to have 4 joints in the upper leg, but 2 of them are moulded detail that doesn't function. Had they been functional, I can't imagine it would have been good for the kit's stability, so I reckon the right approach was taken here. The front of the foot, which is basically a hoof, connects via a ball joint for a full range of motion, and the heel struts plug in via a peg. This assembly is for the rest form, but I'll show the alternate transformations for the feet later on. Probably the biggest work I did on the legs involved the wheels, which store in the calves when not in use. They're constructed from 2 pieces that combine, and so they're non-functional. However, each wheel has its own peg, which I figure is a side effect of the high-grade Gilbow replacing the wheels with individual thrusters. Therefore, if you cut the wheels up, they spin freely after all. In the name of functionality and a slightly more realistic appearance, I started chopping. I used my fairly long and fairly broken Citadel nippers to separate each wheel, then gave them a good sanding to ensure they had enough clearance to actually spin. This did remove some moulded detail, but said detail was rather obfuscated by the connection point, so I wasn't too bothered. I also ran a drill bit through each wheel to reduce the friction slightly. In action, the wheels don't roll particularly well, as there probably isn't enough pressure on them, which is surprising given the heft of this mecha, but hey, I was happy with the fact it rolled at all. In terms of detail, the legs are probably the blandest portion of the mecha, prioritising a functional look over the eye candy of the graffiti patterns and flashy greens and blues. There are some more geometric patterns at least, though a couple are rather out of the way on the back skirts. The ones on the side of each leg have more of an impact, but I highly recommend taking a knife to them once in situ. Tracing alongside the raised areas will make them sit far nicer. As with the arm joints, I popped some gold on all the raised circular details. I reckon it has more of an impact here, even if I was slightly messy with my application. I also applied a little bit of shine silver to the circular details on the lower leg armour. Dark grey stickers are provided for this, but I wasn't a fan, even if it would have probably broken up the white a little bit more. The Daisy Ogre has a few weapons to hand, including a large handheld rifle. It's built from 4 pieces, and it's a big gun that looks nice. Which is all there is to say about it really. There's also a small 3-barrel weapon, the smoke discharger, mounted on the Daisy Ogre's back, and it comes together just as easy. Surprisingly, the barrels attach via some very small ball joints, giving them a decent bit of pivot. It's handy given the static nature of the body. There's 2 connection points on either side of the Daisy Ogre, but I'd recommend using the ones furthest back, as the coffin will have trouble opening otherwise. Finally, there's that rather awesome saw chain, a big serrated whip that fires from the grey section on the left arm. The fully extended form of the chain is moulded from a more flexible form of polystyrene on runner A, and it's all one piece. On one hand, this is much less annoying than the usual practice of running a wire through a billion small pieces, but getting the chain to hold its position is a little bit tougher. Even when folded in on itself, the chain gradually attempts to reset its position, which in turn makes the folded areas look a bit obvious. On the bright side, the polystyrene base means you're free to lob Gundam marker on it, so you can probably guess which one I went with. Like other flexible plastics I've attempted to paint, it wasn't long before the finish tarnished and came off in some areas, but on the shelf it'll still look a good deal better than the original dull grey. There's also the unextended chain, which is made from the usual hard plastic and therefore should hold the paint a lot better. With much of the kit already panel lined and stickered over the course of assembly, there wasn't much in the way of final touches to do, although I did get a rather nasty shock whilst poring over the manual for the sticker locations. There's actually a good deal of grey missing from the mecha, particularly around back, and the lower arms are supposed to be in 2 tones of blue. Now I can't imagine this would actually be too hard to do, just a bit of masking tape and some grey spray paint, but with how detailed the kit already is, I didn't feel like it was really necessary to add even more to it. That said, I did attempt to fill in some small segments in grey, using my Gundam marker. As was the case every other time I've used that thing, the results were comically inconsistent, so I didn't go overboard. Finally, I did consider varnishing this set, as I didn't use any flow-type markers on it, but I decided against that for a few reasons. For one, I didn't want to muck up the chrome finish on the inner body. Then, I was a bit unsure of the weather, which has been jumping between absurdly hot and absurdly soggy, usually twice in one day. And last but not least, I've somehow acquired a rattle can that doesn't actually rattle. I did try giving the stand and smoke discharger a once-over with it, but the coat ended up slightly funny looking, so I've left the rest of the model as is for now. And with those not particularly extensive finishing touches applied, here's the high-grade Daisy Ogre, ready to roll around the apocalypse, fighting monsters and mechs alike. Besides those missing paint applications, this is spot on to the series design, right down to the panel lining and decals. Plus, those decorations follow up to deliver a highly detailed piece that really won't look out of place alongside some real grades, with the build feeling a little more involved than a high grade. The colour scheme is nicely balanced, with the dull white and very bright green contrasting nicely against the blue arms and the grey and black of the inner mechanics. Whilst building, it felt like the nub marks could be a problem, but with everything assembled, nothing particularly stands out. Overall, it has an enormous amount of character to it, making for a fun take on a more functional and less humanoid mecha. In terms of size, the kit is technically non-scale, although the minifigures seem to be a similar height to a Warhammer miniature. The Ogre then is around the same height as a classic Gundam in 1/144th scale, although the former is obviously much bulkier. When up against its fellow Synduality offering, the high-grade Gilbow, I much prefer the Daisy Ogre's final appearance. Although the sharper edges and utilitarian aesthetic of the Gilbow definitely appeal to me, not to mention that big clear scythe thingy, building the Daisy Ogre felt a bit more engaging, owing to the less monochromatic colour scheme and superior panel lining opportunities. Of course, I did put a fair bit more effort into the Daisy Ogre, such as with the pilots, but the Gilbow also has double the stickers, some of which do a rough job of colour correction. There's a fair bit of stuff the kit can do, but a wide range of poses isn't quite on that list. The Daisy Ogre has a fairly rudimentary range of motion for a high grade, and a few design decisions end up restricting what you get. The worst offenders are the ball-jointed hips. For one, they're ludicrously stiff, and they don't have much in the way of side-to-side movement. Complicating matters further, the back skirt armour can get in the way when the waist is rotated, and more often than not, they like to pop off. An annoying trait that they share with the knees, which impact the reach of the lower legs a bit, and the feet, which gradually twist off the joint as you wiggle them into position. As mentioned earlier, the arms are slightly restricted by the lack of a shoulder swing, but the way the forearm slides out for better clearance, as well as the wrist pivot, show that articulation was still factored into the design, something also reflected in the ab crunch and the lower legs. With a bit of perseverance, and more often than not the included stand, the Daisy Ogre can achieve some dramatic poses, but getting there may test your patience. In the end, it's not quite on the level of the high-grade Xabungle or Rising Freedom Gundam, but given I've bought Transformers from this year with no bicep swivels, I'm fairly content with what you do get. As for the things the Daisy Ogre can do, there's the opening cockpit and coffin for Kanata and Noir respectively. Kanata is permanently situated in the Ogre, and the process of opening the cockpit is pretty satisfying thanks to those double jointed pistons. Meanwhile, Noir has to make do with standing in the back, which seems a bit grim. Never mind the fact it's called a coffin. Someone ought to tell Kanata that sticking your friends in the car boot isn't very nice. Once Noir is clipped in, the outer doors are locked into place by the ceiling, which is a simple but effective bit of engineering. I discussed the weapons earlier, but I will add that converting the hand to hold the rifle feels more involved than it needed to be, mainly because the fingers peg into the hand very tight. You also have to ensure the arm is clicked into place when extended or collapsed, or the joint becomes rather floppy. Not ideal given the size and weight of the rifle. Wrapping up this whistle-stop tour of the Daisy Ogre, there's 3 different forms of locomotion, replicated via a tiny bit of parts forming. We've already seen the rest form, but the walking mode merely involves swapping out the heel strut on each foot for a straightened one, then adjusting the Daisy Ogre so that it's standing on those... hooves? I guess Ungully grade mechs are a thing now, and this thing is so comically top heavy that the stand becomes essential here. There is still an element of balance even with the stand, as it's fairly lightweight, and in certain poses it'll topple over with the Ogre. But coupled with the fairly solid reach of the lower legs, some fairly decent running or walking poses can be had, although a fancier action base probably wouldn't go amiss either. The final transformation is for roller dashing. Those wheels I separated earlier finally come into play, along with some minor parts rearrangement and another additional piece. In this form, it's still a little prone to falling over, but it's much easier to get it balanced, and the results look awesome. Those separated wheels don't roll particularly well, but it's not like I'll be rolling this thing around that much. Overall, the Daisy Ogre is definitely a kit where the build process kind of overshadows the final model. It's not particularly difficult to assemble, but there's a good amount of moving pieces and gimmicks available, and a lot of places to detail up and even modify, as with the wheels. The end product is full of charm and character, with solid colour separation and all. The weapons are quite simple in their execution, but they do a solid job, with the rifle rocking that bright green, and the chain giving the imposing mecha an even greater shelf presence. However, even with the unique leg construction and sliding arm joint, the final posability of the kit is a bit limited, with the top-heavy design, clashing armour segments, design choices in the arms and hips, and pieces that like to fall off when manipulated all having an impact. With some patience and imagination, the Ogre can definitely appear dynamic and exciting on a shelf, it's just not the kit's strongest aspect. With all that said, I still recommend giving this kit a go if you find one. Even if you're unfamiliar with the source material, it's a fun build that will keep you engaged, with lots of functional elements and unorthodox decorations, although it's worth keeping in mind that a fully accurate build will require the paintbrushes. At a minimum, I highly advise to paint the pilots, as it improves the cockpit and coffin gimmicks immensely. In terms of an alternative, there is also the more recent Daisy Ogre Alter to keep an eye out for. It updates the original with some fresh teal arms and knees, and some new weapons to boot, including a wicked flip-out sword attached to the left arm. And with that, another build video is... Ogre. I'm very sorry everyone. But that'll do it for the high-grade Daisy Ogre, who is off to join the high-grade Xabungle and Xabungle Valkyrie in the non-Gundam high-grade corner of my shed. I hope you enjoyed watching me chuck this thing together, and if you've got any questions about the build, pop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. Until next time, thanks for watching, and take care everyone.